All right, thank you. So I'll just do a quick recap of what we learned yesterday, and then I'll proceed to the to today's class. So yesterday we looked at these individual eigenfunctions for the various n, l, m values, right? And we had a table for it. And now, and after this, using this table, we created, right? We made plots for the wave function versus r and the probability density versus r. Okay, and those are important wave functions, important plots, because that tells us something about the probability of finding the electron in a certain region from the origin or a certain distance away from the origin. So that is the radial part. So using the radial, right, let's see where was it. So plotting the radial wave function with respect to r by a and plotting the radial probability density with respect to r by a, we can get a sense of what is the probability of finding the electron at a certain distance away from the nucleus in the various orbitals. So we saw this for 1s, 2s, right, 2p, 3s, 3p, and so on. Okay, and that gives us a sense of what is happening. All right. Okay, so for example, this is the 2p, right? 2p level, because this r is 2, sorry, n is 2 and l is 1. And we also saw what we mean by the three quantum numbers. The three quantum numbers that we got were n, l, and m. And we saw what those three represent, right? So I think in yesterday's class, we saw all that. And then we also looked at the angular part of the wave function, right? Or for the hydrogen atom. So using the angular part of the wave function, we were able to discern what is the shape of p, x, py, pz orbital, and also what is the shape of all the five d orbitals, right? And that is very important because that it just like just doing a linear combination of the angular part of the wave function, we were able to get all of these, the three p orbitals and the five d orbitals. Okay, and that is something that we have learned, like the first time I think all of us were introduced to all of these orbitals were in probably our 11th or 12th standard, right? And finally now you're able to see where it comes from, and I think that is very interesting. I hope you appreciate the fact that how just by solving the Schrodinger equation you get all these orbitals, and that forms the basis of chemistry, right? Basis of all the everything that we know about atoms, electrons, molecules. It all comes down to this, to knowing the orbital levels and to knowing how many or how the electrons are occupied in those orbitals, right? And that is like everything originates from there. And so quantum mechanics is something that is very important to know what is the origin of all of these concepts that we already know, right? And then later on in the next semester, I think, when you learn spectroscopy, you will appreciate it even more, right? You will see how you can get the properties of all of these molecules because you know what is the quantum mechanical basis of it. Okay, so that is something you will appreciate even more in the next semester. All right, so we saw what are all these, the way that px, py, pz orbitals are represented, and also the 5d orbitals, right? And I think we stopped there. And then there was one thing that I explained to you, which was the what happens to energy levels of an hydrogen atom when it experiences a magnetic field. Okay, in that case, what happens? The m levels. So for any particular value of L, let's say for L equal to 1, there are three possible m values, plus 1, 0, and minus 1. So when there is no magnetic field, those three levels are at the same energy, level. And then when there is a magnetic field, those three m levels basically split up into three different levels. And so when you look at the spectra, energy spectra for this, for such a system with a magnetic field, which is in the presence of a magnetic field, you will see three lines instead of one line. Similarly, for L equal to 2, you will have 5 m values. And so with no magnetic field, all those 5 will be at the same energy level. So they will be degenerate. And then when you apply a magnetic field, you will see 5 non-degenerate levels. Okay, in the case of L equal to 2. All right, so that is the concept, and that concept is known as the Zeeman effect. That splitting of energy levels under the presence of magnetic field, that is known as the Zeeman effect. Okay, and then I think we also saw how to treat hydrogen-like atoms. So by hydrogen-like atoms, we mean that the atomic number can be different from hydrogen, but the number of electrons stays the same as that of hydrogen, which is equal to 1. Okay, so such atoms are basically these ionized atoms, which is He plus, Li2 plus, Be3 plus, right? The atomic number changes, but the number of electrons in the system remains the same as hydrogen, which is equal to 1. So in such a case, there is a very small change to the potential energy, which is, so instead of just minus E square by 4 pi epsilon naught, you will get minus Z E square by 4 pi epsilon naught into 1 by R. Okay. So this Z, extra factor of Z is the only additional change you have because of this different atomic numbers. Okay, and then you solve for the you solve for energy and wave function values in the same way using the Schrodinger equation, and you will see that energy turns out to be minus Z square E naught by N square. E naught is obviously minus 13.6 electron volt, so this turns out to be minus Z square E naught by N square. Okay, so this is where we stopped yesterday. So now I'll move on to the next part. Okay. Oh, I don't know why it's asking me to give entry when actually I have already. All right. Okay, so now we will move on to the next part. Any questions up to this portion? Okay, so everything that we'll talk now today is a kind of a build up onto this, what we have already studied. Okay, so yesterday we talked about what happens to the atom when it is in the presence of a magnetic field. Okay, we can also do similar kind of study when there is an electric field, and that study or that effect is known as the Stark effect. So Stark effect is basically effect of an external uniform weak electric field on the energy levels of an atom. Okay, so Zeeman effect and Stark effect are like there is a correspondence, right? In the sense that Zeeman effect is for magnetic field, Stark effect is for electric field. Okay, so if you look at an unperturbed Hamiltonian of a hydrogen atom, like when there is no electric field, in that case, the Hamiltonian looks like this, right? This is the kinetic energy term, mu is the reduced mass. This is the Coulombic potential. Okay, so this is just our normal Hamiltonian for the hydrogen atom. Now, when you apply an electric field, and let's say the electric field is applied in the Z direction, so the Hamiltonian, the extra term that gets added to the Hamiltonian due to the electric field is basically E into epsilon dot R. Epsilon is your electric field. So if the electric field is applied in the Z direction, then E dot R will give you, or rather, sorry, epsilon dot R will give you epsilon Z. Okay, so this is going to be your Hamiltonian additional term in your Hamiltonian. So we call this HP. Okay, so this is your additional term. Okay, so your total Hamiltonian is just a combination of these two, which is H naught plus HP. Okay, so we are not going to go into the details of the calculation, but suffice it to know that if you just apply H naught to the wave function, you are going to get E naught into psi. Okay, and if you apply apply H naught to the ground state of the wave function, what is the ground state of the hydrogen atom? Ground state of hydrogen atom is the 1s state, right? Because there is only one electron, so ground state is the 1s state. So in the 1s state, 1s can be represented as 1, 0, 0, right? N is 1, L is 0, M is 0. Okay, so that's all I have done here. So if you apply H naught to the ground state of hydrogen atom, you're going to get E0 for the ground state multiplied with psi. Okay, this is all. There's nothing new here. Now, if you apply H psi, right? If you apply the full Hamiltonian to the wave function, okay, which is nothing but H0 plus HP into psi, you will get E0 plus delta E into psi. Okay, and what is this delta E? Okay, this delta E is the additional term. Okay, E0 we already know, which is minus 13.6 electron volt, and if N is 1, then this is going to be 1. Okay, that is your E0. And delta E, this additional term is basically this particular term. Okay, so this kind of term comes in from the perturbation theory and such like that. Or you can solve it from variational theorem. But the point is that there is an extra term which is quadratic in the electric field. Okay, that is the main concept here. Okay, there are some additional terms here, but this delta E is basically quadratic in electric field because you have a epsilon square. Okay, so essentially the main thing here is that if you apply an electric field and the hydrogen atom experiences that electric field, in that case the energy is shifted by some delta E, and that delta E is goes as square of the electric field. Okay, so that is the main thing here, and that is known as the Stark effect. Okay, so you can see what is the difference between Zeeman effect and Stark effect. In Zeeman effect, basically there is a splitting of the energy levels. Okay, and your degenerate states become non-degenerate. In the Stark effect, there is simply a shift in the energy. Okay, and the energy is shifted as square of the electric field. All right, so that is your Stark effect. Any questions? All right. Okay. So I'm going to, this is a homework. Okay, this is a homework problem. You can look at it and you can try to solve it. Basically, it is a solved problem, but I want you to look at it, understand it, and then do it for yourself. Okay, that way you'll get some practice and you'll also know how two different potentials, two different Hamiltonians, right, are combined together and solved for. Okay, so the question is, consider a spinless particle of mass m, which is moving in a 3D potential. Okay, so it is in a 3D potential, basically it is like that infinite square well, but in one part of the infinite square well, you have a harmonic potential as well. Okay, in one direction, you have a harmonic potential, in the other directions, you have a infinite square well. Okay, so this is a combination of two kinds of potentials, right? So the question is, write down the total energy and the total wave function of the particle. So that is the first question. Second question is, assuming that h cross omega is much greater than 3 pi square h cross square by 2m a square, find the energies and the corresponding degeneracies for the ground state and first excited state. Okay, so you know that in an infinite square potential, for a three-dimensional infinite square potential, we had got some degenerate states, right? I think I've also given you such a question in the quiz as well, where in the quiz, I think I've given you for a 2D infinite square potential, and there were some degenerate states, right? So here also in a three-dimensional infinite square potential also, there might be some degenerate states, and they're asking you to find out like what are the levels at which there is degeneracy and which levels do not have any degeneracy, right? That's the question. Then the third question is, assume now that in addition to the potential, right, in addition to basically this potential, this particle also has a negative electric charge minus q, and that it is subjected to a constant electric field epsilon directed along the z-axis. Okay, the Hamiltonian along the z-axis is thus given by this. So basically, you have a harmonic potential. This is the Hamiltonian for the harmonic potential, and then additionally, you have an electric field potential as well. Okay, so if this is your total Hamiltonian, they want you to find out, derive the energy expression for this particle and also its total energy. Then find the energies and the corresponding degeneracies for the ground state and first excited state. Okay, so this problem will just show you how to combine two different potentials and try to solve for the Schrodinger equation. Okay, all right. Any questions? Okay, so now I'm going to do two more, rather one full problem and one like half. I'll just introduce a problem. Okay, and then we'll see why or how we can extend whatever we have learned so far to other problems. Okay, so far we have solved three particular type of potentials, right? One was the infinite square well potential and the finite square well potential. Those two are related. Then the second type of potential that we saw was the harmonic potential. And then the third potential that we saw was the Coulombic potential, which was in the case of hydrogen atom, right? So we have already seen three different types of potential. Okay, so now the next two problems that we are going to look at are the extension or some variation of these three potentials. Okay, so let's look at that. So next what we'll do is we'll look at the rigid rotator problem. Okay, so rigid rotator essentially consists of two masses, okay, separated by some distance r, okay, and there is a rotation about the center of the mass of this, about the center of mass axis, okay. So that is your rigid rotator. Okay, so this rigid rotator is basically a model for a diatomic molecule. So if you take a diatomic molecule and the molecule, one molecule has mass m1, another molecule has mass m2, and you want to look at its rotational aspect, then this is the problem that you are going to look at. Okay, basically rigid rotator is uh, embodiment of this rotational property of the diatomic molecule. Okay, so let's look at this problem. We have m1 mass, m2. M1 is a particle, m2 is a particle. So m1 is the mass of the first particle, m2 is the mass of the second particle, and these two are separated by some distance r. The distance r is always fixed. It is not changing in time or it is not changing at all. Okay, r is always fixed. You are just looking at how this entire molecule is rotating about its center of mass axis. Okay, so r is fixed. The two masses m1 and m2 are rotating about the center of mass. So if there are two masses, then we always look at it in terms of the reduced mass, and so reduced mass is given by this formula. Okay, so we specify that mu is the reduced mass of this system. Okay, so what we can do, we can treat a rigid rotator as one mass that is fixed at the origin, and the other mass, the reduced mass mu, rotating about the origin at a fixed distance r, right? Which is the what I have drawn here. Okay, so one mass is fixed and the other one is rotating about the fixed mass. Okay, so that is what I've drawn here. So because it is rotating, it's always in motion. The energy of the rigid rotator, okay, which is the kinetic, is given by the kinetic energy. And so kinetic energy of something that is rotating is basically your half I omega square, right? I is the moment of inertia of the system. Omega is the angular velocity, right? So half I omega square is your kinetic energy of a rotating system, okay? And I is given by mu into r square. Mu is the reduced mass, r is the distance between m1 and m2. Okay, so everything here is known. And if you want to look at just the angular momentum, then that is L, and L is given by I into omega. Okay, this is something we already know from physics. We are not doing anything new here. All right. So now the Hamiltonian of a rigid rotator, okay, because it's only moving, right? It's always just moving about that origin, and and there is only kinetic energy. Okay, so the Hamiltonian is given only by the kinetic energy of the system. There is no potential energy because the potential energy, generally potential energy depends on the distance r, right? In this case, that distance would probably be r. But in this case, r is always fixed. It is not changing at all. Okay, so it is not really a variable. It's just like a fixed parameter. It's not at all a variable. So there is no potential energy that this is experiencing. Okay, all right. So the Hamiltonian is just given by the kinetic energy, and that is basically minus h cross square by 2I into del square. Okay, del square is your Laplacian operator that we already know. And r is treated as some constant parameter. Okay, it's not a variable, it is just a constant parameter. Okay. So now, as you can imagine, this is del square and it is in 3 dimensions, right? So, and because there is spherical symmetry, because the molecule is, the second mass is rotating about the first mass, and the first mass is assumed to be fixed at origin. In that case, there is some kind of spherical symmetry. And so we will express this Hamiltonian, which is right now written in terms of Cartesian coordinates, we'll express it in terms of spherical coordinates. And remember that r is still fixed. So the only two variables that we have to consider in the spherical coordinates are the angular variables. Okay, and the angular variables are your theta and phi. Okay, so theta and phi are the only two variables that we have to consider, right? Because r is constant. Okay, so when you convert this Hamiltonian, which is written in terms of Cartesian coordinates, right? You can convert this Hamiltonian to in terms of and write it in terms of spherical coordinates. So in spherical coordinates, this will be your Hamiltonian now. Okay. And second thing, you also know that kinetic energy can also be written as L square by 2I, right? Because L is equal to I omega and K is equal to half I omega square, right? So if you combine these two, you will see that K can be written as L omega, right? Sorry, K can be written as L square by 2I. Okay, so in that case, your L square operator is also basically this operator. Okay, so you can see what is the difference between H Hamiltonian operator and the L square operator. Only difference is that in Hamiltonian, you have a divided by 2I here, and in L square, you don't have that divided by 2I. Okay, that is the only difference. Everything else is the same. Okay, so whatever energy value that you get for Hamiltonian using the Hamiltonian, same kind of eigenvalue you're going to get for the L square operator also, right? Because these two will basically share the eigenstate, okay? Because they are essentially one operator can be written as a factor into the other operator, which means the eigenstate will be the same, and the eigenvalue may differ by a operator or something like that. Sorry, not by a constant. Okay, so the eigenstate will definitely be the same. They share the eigenstate. Okay, so let's see. Now we have to solve. What we have to do is we have to apply this Hamiltonian onto an eigenfunction and try to solve for the eigenfunction as well as the energy value. Same kind of thing that we have been doing all along, right? We need to solve for psi and E. Okay, so that's what we need to do. So let's apply the Schrodinger equation. H psi is equal to E psi. And we write, because psi is in terms of only two variables, which are the angular variables, so theta and phi. So what we do, we write psi in terms of theta and phi, and our natural convention is taking it as y of theta comma phi. Okay, this is same thing that we have done in the hydrogen atom as well, right? So exactly same thing that we are doing here. So now what we do is, we again do a separation of variables, right? Because that would be our first natural thing to do. So we do a separation of variables, that is we write psi, y of theta comma phi as a product of two functions, one function being a function only of theta and the other function being a function only of phi. Okay, so this is what we do. We do a separation of variables. So like before, what we do, we substitute this theta of theta into phi of phi wherever we have psi in the Schrodinger equation. Okay, so wherever we have psi, instead of psi, we substitute this particular function. And this is the Hamiltonian that, and sorry, this is the Schrodinger equation that we will get. Okay. So now you can see that again, like before, like how we have done for hydrogen atom, we see that the first curly bracket has only terms which is a variable of theta, or which is a function of theta, and the second curly bracket only has terms which are functions of phi. So these two are completely independent of each other. And these two add up to 0. So what we'll do is we treat each of these curly brackets equal to some constant. And like before, what we'll do is we'll take it to be n square. We'll take that constant to be n square. Okay, so the first curly bracket, we equate it to m square, and the second curly bracket, we equate it to minus m square, so that they add up to 0. Okay, so this is what we do. And here beta, if you simplify, if you substitute this function instead of psi, and you kind of simplify it and do some simplifications, you will see that beta is equal to 2i e by h cross square. Okay, so there is nothing much that we have done here, exactly like how we proceeded for hydrogen atom case. Similarly, we are proceeding here also for the rigid rotator case. We are not doing anything special here. Okay, now the second equation, as you can see, this is very easy to solve because this is a standard second order differential equation. And so the solution for this differential equation, as in the case of hydrogen atom, same solution we get, which is e power im5. Okay, so this is the solution for the second equation here. So this is am into e power im5. Am is some normalization constant. Okay. And then from equation 1, if we solve equation 1, just like we did for hydrogen atom, we will see that when we solve for equation 1, we get theta, the function theta to be a function of, to be some Legendre polynomial, which is basically PLM of cos theta and with some normalization constant. Okay, so this is what it is. And beta turns out to be L into L plus 1. Okay, and L is an integer going from 0 to n minus 1, right? So that is your beta. Okay, and beta, we have also taken here beta equal to 2IE by h cross square. So if we now equate these two, you will get E is equal to h cross square by 2I into L plus 1. Okay, so this is an important equation. All right, so this tells you the energy of the rigid rotator. So the energy of the rigid rotator, right, it only depends on the quantum number L. It does not depend on anything else. Only thing, because everything else is a constant, right? H is a constant, I is a constant, because mu is a constant and R is also fixed. So all of these things are constant, and only thing that it depends on is the L. Okay, L is your quantum number, right? L is your angular quantum number. All right. So finally, the wave function turns out to be y lm of theta comma phi, which is some complicated equation, and it's a Legendre polynomial. So this first part of the equation is your normalization constant because all of these are constants, and this part depends on theta alone, and this part depends on phi alone. Okay, so this is your final wave function. Okay, now there are some implications of this energy and these results that we have got. So I'll discuss that now. Any questions up to this part? Okay, you understand we are doing the same kind of steps that we did in hydrogen atom. We are not doing anything different. And so I have not shown you all the steps because the steps are exactly the same. Only thing different here is that we consider R to be a constant. And since R is a constant, we do not consider that to be part of the differential equation, right? Because R is a constant. So R is just treated as a parameter and not as a variable. Okay, that is the only difference between hydrogen atom and the rigid rotor problem. Okay. All right. So finally, the wave function also that you get for a rigid rotor does not have the radial part of the wave function. It only has the angular part of the wave function. Okay. All right. So now we have also seen that L square psi is equal to E psi. Okay. So E is nothing but your h cross square by 2I into L plus 1. Okay. So basically, because these two operators are very closely related to each other, so the eigenstate and eigen values will be same. Okay. So now rigid rotator, as I've already told you, is a model for rotating diatomic molecule. And electromagnetic radiation can cause a rigid rotor or a diatomic molecule to undergo transitions from one state to another. And now because the rigid rotor problem only has the energy depends only on the L quantum number, right? So the transitions will basically mean that you're changing L. So essentially you're going from one L to another L. Okay, let's say you're going from L equal to 1 to L equal to 2, or you're going from L equal to 2 or L equal to 1 to L equal to 0, right? Something like that. So that is the transition that you mean. Okay, so you're going from one L level to another L level. Okay, and that can go in both directions. Either you can go up or you can go down. But there is a constraint. The constraint is that you can only go one up or one down. Okay, you cannot go more than that. Okay, so that constraint is known as the selection rule in spectroscopy. So essentially that constraint means that your delta L, okay, the change in L should only be either plus or minus 1. So you can only go one up or one down. You cannot go from 0 to 2. You can only go from 0 to 1 or 0 to -1. Sorry, there is no -1 in the case of L, but you can only go from 2 to 1 or 1 to 2, but you cannot go from 1 to 3, for example, or 0 to 2, for example. Okay, that is not possible. All right, so the delta E, right? If delta L changes, if delta L is something, then delta E, okay, what is the energy of the transition? Okay, how much is the energy changing due to the transition? That is your delta E. And delta E is your E of L plus 1 minus E of L, right? So you can just substitute this in the formula. What is the formula? This is the formula. H cross square by 2I into L plus 1. Okay. Substitute L in this formula and you will get H cross, basically you will get H cross square by I into L plus 1. That is your delta E. Again, L can go from 0, 1, 2, etc. Okay, up to N minus 1. So this is your delta E. Okay. Now in this delta E, again, you can see that H cross square and I, these are constants, and only variable that you can say that it depends on is your L value. Okay. So if you know your L value, you know everything about the transition. Also, delta E has to correspond to some frequency, right? And the energy is related to frequency using this formula, right? Which is H into nu. Okay. So H is the Planck's constant, nu is the frequency. So delta E is H nu. So if you combine these two, right? And we also know delta E is equal to H cross square by I into L plus 1 for this rotational transition. Okay. So if we combine these two equations, we can get the equation for frequency, right? So frequency turns out to be H by 4 pi square I into L plus 1. So this is your formula for the frequency. So I think only thing that you need to remember out of all these formulas is your formula for the energy, which is H cross square by 2I into L plus 1. If you remember this formula, then everything else follows from there. So you don't have to remember anything else. All right. So this frequency, you will see, lies in the microwave region. It typically always lies in the microwave region. Okay, so I've given you a small problem. You just have to substitute all of these things in the formula for frequency and get what is the actual frequency value. Okay, so remember that for the transitions, energy transitions for a rigid rotor always lies in the microwave region. And so from this, we basically go to microwave spectroscopy, which you will learn in the next semester. Okay. And of course, there is a selection rule for microwave spectroscopy, and that is the constraint. Okay. So the constraint is that you can only go either one up or one down. You cannot go more than 2 levels up or 2 levels down in the during the energy transitions of a rigid rotor. Okay. So that is your, this is your homework problem. So reduced mass of a diatomic molecule is 10 power minus 25 kg. The bond distance is 10 power minus 10 meters. Using these values, calculate the frequency of electromagnetic radiation. Show that nu lies in the microwave region of the spectrum. So this is your homework problem. You just have to substitute all of this in this frequency formula and see whether the frequency is actually in the microwave region or not. All right. Okay. So with this now, any questions up to this part? Okay. So when you study, okay, you don't have to remember these complicated wave functions because really that's not important. But you do have to remember what is the energy. Okay, so energy is something that you please make sure that you remember, and everything else follows from the energy, so that should be fine. And you should also learn how to solve these problems. In the sense, you should kind of broadly know what the steps are that you need to apply separation of variables. What is the Hamiltonian for such a system, that you should know, right? Basically this Hamiltonian, because the Hamiltonian is the main thing. So for every problem, the Hamiltonian is what changes, and that leads to different energy and wave function formulas, right? So Hamiltonian is very important, and you need to know what, in which case you will have a potential, in which case there is only kinetic energy term, in which case the potential is different, or the potential, how the potential, depending on what the potential is, what is the eigenfunction that you get. Okay, so those are things that you should try to understand. Okay, all right. Any questions? Okay. So now I'll go to the final part in today's lecture, which is the helium atom. Okay, so helium atom is basically a stand-in for all the other atoms. Uh, so in helium atom, there are three things that we have. Okay, there are 2 electrons and 1 nucleus, right? So essentially, it's a three-body problem. Okay, so let's say the nucleus is at a distance r, capital R, from the origin, and the first electron is at a distance r1 from the origin, and the second electron is at a distance r2 from the origin. Okay, and these two electrons are moving about the nucleus, right? And so this is a three-body problem, essentially. So what would the Hamiltonian look like for a three-body problem? First of all, there has to be a kinetic energy term associated with each of these parts. So for electron, first electron, second electron, and the nucleus, there has to be a kinetic energy term associated with it. That is given. And then what is the potential energy? So potential energy terms have to be basically the interaction between electron 1 and nucleus, interaction between electron 2 and nucleus, and interaction between the two electrons themselves, right? So those are the basically three terms in the potential energy, okay? And then you add up all of it, kinetic energy plus potential energy, you get the total Hamiltonian. Okay, so let's look at it. So capital R is the position of the nucleus from the origin, small r1 position of electron 1, small r2 position of electron 2. Capital M is mass of nucleus, M1 is mass of electron 1, M2 is mass of electron 2. Okay. So in the case of electron 1, electron 2, both are basically electrons, so they will have same mass, right? So basically M1 and M2 is equal to ME. Okay. So this is your Schrodinger equation. So like I told you, first part will have a kinetic energy term. So this one is kinetic energy of the nucleus. This one is the kinetic energy of the first electron. This one is kinetic energy of the second electron. Okay. And the wave function is a function of capital R, R1 and R2. Okay. All right. Now we go to the potential energy. So this term is a potential energy for, or it represents the attraction between electron and nucleus. This term again represents attraction between electron 2, that is the second electron, and the nucleus. And this term represents the repulsion, okay, and that is why there is a positive term, positive sign here. So this term represents the repulsion between the first and the second electron. Okay, so that is why you can see that over here the distance goes as r1 minus r2. Here the distance goes as capital R minus r2. And here the distance goes as capital R minus r1. Okay, and this multiplied with psi gives you E into psi. Okay, so this is basically your Schrodinger equation. Similarly, I think you can now write for any atom, right? So if I give you now a beryllium, right, or a lithium, lithium has 3 electrons, right? So it has 3 electrons, 1 nucleus, so there will be 4 terms in the kinetic energy term. And in the potential energy term, there will be interaction between every component, right? So that will be your potential energy term. Okay, so I think similarly you can write the Schrodinger equation for any atom now. Okay, this is the basic principle that you have to follow. You have to write the individual kinetic energy terms, and then you have to write the interaction between the individual components. That is your potential energy term. Okay. Now you can see one more thing here, that there is a 2 over here. Okay. If you look at the case of hydrogen atom, let's see. Okay, so this is the potential energy for hydrogen-like atom. So whenever you look at potential energy for hydrogen-like atom, there is a Z, and Z represents the atomic number. So same thing we have used here. So for helium, Z turns out to be 2, right? Atomic number is 2. And so we have included a 2 here. Okay, there's a factor of 2 here and a factor of 2 here. Okay, in your Coulombic potential. But in this case, when we represent repulsion between the two electrons, right, the interaction between two electrons does not have a 2 because the interaction is only between electron and not between electron and something else, right? So here there is no 2, but in these two cases, there is a factor of 2. Is that clear? Okay, so this is basically your Schrodinger equation for the helium atom. Now we make a slight simplification, okay, which makes our problem slightly easier but does not do much. So that slight simplification is that because the mass of mass of nucleus is much greater than the mass of any of the two electrons, okay, we consider that compared to the electrons, the nucleus is almost considered to be at the origin because it is more localized compared to the electron, right? Because electron is even lighter, so it is more delocalized, but nucleus is more localized. So we consider that nucleus is at the origin, whereas the electrons are moving about the nucleus. They are moving rapidly, so we only consider what is the motion of electrons and not the motion of nucleus. So this is an approximation, but it is a valid enough approximation because yes, compared to the electron, the nucleus is not moving much, right? So that is a valid approximation. So because we now consider nucleus to be at the origin, our Hamiltonian reduces a bit. Okay, so the Hamiltonian now has only two terms in the kinetic energy, right? Minus h cross square by 2me into del 1 square plus del 2 square of into psi. And it has this, but this potential energy term needs to be there, just that R becomes 0, right? Because we consider R to be at the origin. So R becomes 0, and so we have minus 2 e square by 4 pi epsilon naught into 1 by r1 plus 1 by r2 into psi, and plus the interaction between the two electrons that stays. So that is just your e square by 4 pi epsilon naught into r1 minus r2 into psi is equal to e psi. So this is your Hamiltonian now. This is your simplified Hamiltonian. Okay. Now this system is so complicated. Okay. Had there not been this particular term, we would have still been able to solve it. But because of the presence of this term, okay, this 1 by r1 minus r2, right? This variable or this potential complicates it so much that we cannot really solve it exactly. Okay, so this equation, even just for the helium atom itself, you see that the Schrodinger equation becomes unsolvable. Okay, so if for the helium atom itself it is unsolvable, then you can imagine for lithium, beryllium, nitrogen, oxygen, for all of those atoms, how unsolvable it is. Okay, so we cannot really solve it exactly. In that case, what we have to do, we have to use some approximation methods in order to solve it. Okay, so I will not go into detail about the approximation methods. I will just tell you what it is and we'll stop there. Because that should really be part of the advanced quantum mechanics course, and that cannot be taught in this course. Anyway, so but my main point here was, like, you can see, just hydrogen atom was exactly solvable, but as soon as you just increase one more electron, right, it becomes so unsolvable, right? You cannot really deal with this Hamiltonian at all. This Schrodinger equation becomes really difficult to solve, and we cannot solve it. So far, there is no exact solution for this kind of Schrodinger equation. Of course, the first thing that you do here is to convert it to spherical coordinates, because that is the natural progression of things. But even after converting it to spherical coordinates, it does not help much because this is a very complicated Schrodinger equation because of the presence of this particular potential. That is the interaction between the two electrons. Okay, so we cannot solve it. All right. So like I told you, the only way to solve such a system is to use approximation methods. And there are two kinds of approximation. There are many kinds of approximation methods, but there are two main kinds. Okay, and other kinds are basically variation of these two. So these two kinds of approximation methods, one is the perturbation theory, and the second is the variational method. Okay, so I'll just give you a brief, small introduction about each of these methods, and then we'll stop. So what is perturbation method? So basically in perturbation method, what we do, we consider that the Hamiltonian is actually the simple unperturbed Hamiltonian plus some small lambda into the perturbation. Okay. So essentially, in the case of our helium atom system, we can consider that H naught is the Hamiltonian for the hydrogen atom, and then there is some small perturbation to that hydrogen atom Hamiltonian. Okay, so that is your lambda into H dash. That is perturbation. So that is your small perturbation to the original unperturbed Hamiltonian. Okay. So if the Hamiltonian is represented in this manner, then the wave function and energy can be represented as a power series. Okay. So the wave function is basically your unperturbed wave function, which comes out from H naught, plus lambda into the first order correction, plus lambda square into second order correction, plus lambda cube into third order correction of the wave function, and so on. Similarly, the energy can be represented as E naught, which is the unperturbed energy, plus lambda into the first order correction for energy, lambda square into second order correction of energy, plus lambda cube into third order correction for energy, and so on. Okay, so this is basically your so essentially, in the perturbation method, what you do is you write hydrogen as some H naught, which is unperturbed Hamiltonian, plus small perturbation, and you write wave function and energy as some power series in terms of the first order, second order, third order correction, and so on. Okay, so that is your perturbation method. And if you use such formulas, you can approximately get what is the wave function and what is the energy value of the system that you are dealing with. Okay. And then there is the second method, which is the variational method. So in the variational method, what you do is you write down a trial wave function. So you guess some very simple wave function and you write it down. And you assume that there are many parameters in this wave function. And then what you do is you apply the Schrodinger equation to that wave function and try to determine what are the parameters. And from there, you can get what is the energy value. So that is the variational method. Okay. So these two are two approximation, the perturbation method and the variational method are the two approximation methods in order to solve such complicated Schrodinger equations. Okay, so I'm not really going to go into that because that is a topic for advanced quantum mechanics. But I just wanted to impress upon you that even though the Schrodinger equation for helium atom is not really solvable, we cannot solve it exactly, but there are some approximation methods that people have used, and through these methods we are able to get approximately to certain accuracy. We are able to get what is the wave function and the energy levels of these complicated systems. Similarly, we can do for other atoms as well. Right? Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and in the next class we will look at I think angular momentum and spin, and that is the end of our quantum mechanics course.